Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Michael Sanders, and this broadcast is coming to you from the auditorium of Canterbury Woods in Pacific Grove. Today I'd like to play a program of impromptus, including the four great impromptus of Chopin. The whole idea, I suppose, of an impromptu seems a little self-contradictory because at least these pieces were thought up by some composer, written down, sold to a publisher. The publisher had them engraved, printed, bound, and sent out to stores. Musicians bought copies of these scores, learned them, perhaps memorized them, maybe even recorded them. So the idea that the impromptu is something spur of the moment or thought up on the spot is a little bit misleading. But I imagine that the reason composers wanted to call their pieces impromptus was to suggest their spontaneous element. The impromptus that I'll play for you are not in the larger fixed forms. There are no fugues, there are no sonata movements, there are no sets of variations. The term impromptu was used first by a publisher in 1817, and just a few years later, Schubert wrote the 8 impromptus that are associated with his name. They appeared in 2 collections, Opus 90 and Opus 143. But something odd happened. In the Opus 90 set, the 3rd and the 4th of those impromptus was never published by the publisher. That includes the impromptu that I want to play for you today, the impromptu in G flat, which is number 3 of Opus 90. It wasn't until years later, after Schubert had died, that another publisher published those remaining impromptus. When it came to the G flat 8 impromptu, he decided that it would be a lot better if he changed the key and the time signature. So Schubert had chosen an unusual key, not unheard of, but unusual, key of G flat major with 6 flats, and the quite unusual time signature of 8/4. And this other publisher published the thing in 4/4 and in the key of G major. Well, you can understand why the publisher might have wanted to do that, because for many amateurs, 6 flats is pretty formidable anyway. And with Schubert's wonderful and imaginative harmonic sense, the music wanders far afield into thickets of double flats. We get to about 11 or 12 flats at one point, and in fact, Schubert finally throws up his hands and cancels all the accidentals, starts all over again for a couple measures. So, anyway, it used to be that people played this impromptu in G major. I think we're back to playing it in G flat. And here is the impromptu, Opus 90, number 3, by Schubert. Thank you. Now, it seems as if all of the great keyboard composers, all Bach, Mozart, Chopin certainly, Liszt, and many others, all the great keyboard composers were also great improvisers. But at least in the case of Chopin, he made a clear distinction between his improvising and his compositions. He might begin a particular piece as an improvisation, but he spent great time and great care in polishing and perfecting all the music that was published under his name. There's a story that once he was at a salon and one of his students played one of Chopin's compositions and played it from memory. And afterward, Chopin reproached the pianist quite severely. He said, "You must never play my music from memory. Otherwise, people will think that you are improvising." Well, there's a story about the first impromptu, which is Opus 29. At the end of the 19th century, half a century after Chopin had died, a novelist, Du Maurier, wrote a novel about an Irish girl named Trilby, who fell into the clutches of an evil hypnotist who trained her to become a great singer. The only reason that that's particularly relevant is that the song that she finally became famous for was not a song at all, but was this first impromptu of Chopin. When you hear it, you'll realize how improbable that was, that any human voice could sing this. You probably have not read Trilby, but you may have heard of the hypnotist. His name was Svengali, and that name has persisted as an evil and hypnotic person. Anyway, here is the first of the 4 impromptus in A flat by Chopin. Another great improviser in a different style was George Gershwin. He was not only an excellent pianist, but he was also a fabulous improviser, we hear. So it's a shame in many ways that he did not write more music specifically for the piano. He wrote countless fabulous songs, often with his brother Ira, but there are only a handful of piano solos. And one of the few that he did write as a piano piece is the impromptu that I want to play for you now. He calls it Impromptu in 2 keys. The 2 keys are D major and E flat major, which are about as far apart as 2 keys can be. But he exaggerates the situation perhaps a little bit. The right hand, it's true, starts out in D major, while the left hand is in E flat. But they all reconcile, both of them end up quite happily in E flat after not very long. You can hear that this piece is almost another song, just waiting for Ira to come up with some witty words to turn it into another popular hit. Here is the impromptu in 2 keys of George Gershwin. The second of the Chopin impromptus is in F sharp major, and it is the one of the 4 that sounds most to me like an improvisation. The other 3 are in more or less fixed forms, but this is a form that is much more poetic and generated in Chopin's freest style. It begins with a noble and eloquent melody, and then that leads into a sort of march, quiet march, and that march opens up into a great military section. And then there is a development based on the beginning melody, which melts into a kind of fantastic section in 30-second notes. And then at the end, the march comes back again, as if perhaps from a distance. Most poetic, I think, of the four impromptus of Chopin, the number 2 in F sharp major. Thank you. Now I'd like to play an impromptu by Zev Confrey, who is an American pianist, popular pianist, and writer of popular piano pieces. This impromptu comes from a set of 3 pieces called Three Little Oddities for pianoforte. And you should know about Zez Confrey that a couple years before he had written an enormously popular piece, sometimes still played, called Kitten on the Keys. He claimed it was inspired by hearing his grandmother's cat walking on a piano. And because that was his most famous piece, when the publisher came to publish this little set of 3 pieces, the publisher added the following preface, which I will read to you now. To those of you who know the delightful pranks of a certain young feline frisking over the ivories, Mr. Zez Confrey needs no introduction. The Kitten on the Keys is a musical classic, not only in the estimation of all cheerful folks fond of a merry tune, but also according to the dictum of not a few sober and serious pundits. Will the composer, presenting himself in a graver mood, be acclaimed with the same unanimity? The publishers hope that these 3 little oddities for the pianoforte will, if possible, make more friends for Mr. Confrey, whose talents are here shown in a new and interesting light. Not so new, however, that now and then there may not be felt the remembered touch of a furry little paw, and that perhaps is no fault. So says the Boston Music Company. Here is Zez Confrey's impromptu from the 3 piano oddities. Thank you. Now here's the third of the three Chopin impromptus. I'm not sure this is so, but it seems to me that this is the least frequently performed of these four popular impromptus. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think perhaps the music has a little bit more reserve to it, though that can't be true of the middle section, which is quite deeply expressive. It's intricate and multi-layered in a way that is not perhaps as immediately striking to an audience as some of the other pieces. Nevertheless, it's quite a beautiful piece, I think. This is the impromptu number 3 in G flat of Chopin. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to the music of Edvard Grieg, surely Norway's greatest composer. At the beginning of his career and at different times in his life, he wrote a few large-scale pieces, his piano concerto, several violin sonatas, string quartet. But he had the insight and perhaps the humility to recognize that his real talent lay in music of a smaller scale. And so though there are a few longer pieces, the piano sonata, a set of variations, the piano music, the best of it, is found in a set of lyric pieces. He wrote 66 of them, in fact, in 10 opus numbers. I'd like to play one of those lyric pieces. This is the Valse Impromptu, the Waltz Impromptu, from opus 47, number 1, of Edvard Grieg. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of a couple impromptus. One could do this over and over again with many other wonderful selections. I want to thank, first of all, Keith Chase for all the hours that he spends in preparing and recording these concerts and then making them available to Blanca Diaz and other members of the staff for broadcast. As you know, we're experimenting this time with broadcasting it not only on Friday at the usual time, but on Saturday morning at 11 and Sunday at 7, in case one of those times is more convenient or even hard to imagine, in case you wanted to hear it a second time. It also will be available, as it always is, on YouTube. So there's one more impromptu, the Fantasy Impromptu of Chopin. It's probably one of Chopin's very most popular, favorite pieces. So it comes as a surprise to some to learn that Chopin never published it. He wrote it in 1834 or 1835, and he hung on to it for another 15 years. And when he died, he ordered that all his unpublished music be destroyed. But Chopin's family directed Chopin's good friend and frequent copyist, Fontana, to preserve some of the pieces that were left over. And this was one of them. Over the years, people have speculated, why did Chopin not publish it? A couple possibilities. It sounds a little uncomfortably like the last movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in a few places. So maybe Chopin was just a little fastidious about that. It also has quite close similarities to a work that was popular in the year that Chopin wrote this impromptu, another impromptu by a man named Moscheles. Well, I've looked at Moscheles' impromptu, and I have to say that Chopin should not feel at all threatened by any comparisons to that work. Well, I think most likely Chopin hung on to it because he was still not completely satisfied with all the details of it. In the 1960s, Artur Rubinstein, the great Polish pianist, bought at auction a manuscript from the estate of the Baroness d'Este, and it is a copy of this Fantasy Impromptu in Chopin's handwriting, dated 1835, with a number of differences from the version you may know. If you happen to be a pianist and have played this piece or have listened to it a lot, you might identify in my performance a couple differences. So maybe this manuscript is Chopin's final statement about the Fantasy Impromptu. Or maybe it's only a stage in a development that never quite settled. Nevertheless, here is the Fantasy Impromptu. It was published after Chopin's death, but it's opus 66 in C sharp minor. Fantasy Impromptu by Chopin.